Hi everyone, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Monday, the 1st of April, April Fool's Day. And I wanted to talk a little bit about A Midsummer Night's Dream. One of the themes of Midsummer Night's Dream is, Lord, what fools these mortals be. So perhaps it's appropriate that we are talking about Midsummer Night's Dream on April Fool's Day, since the play is about fools. And I also wanted to talk about registration. And our schedule is now live for you to be able to review for both the summer and the fall semester. The summer sessions are very condensed. They are half as long as a fall semester. So instead of 16 weeks, they are 18 weeks long. And we have two summer sessions. Summer session one, which begins at the ending of the spring semester and basically continues until about mid-July or so. And then summer session two, which picks up in or begins in mid-July and goes basically up until the fall semester. So we have fewer options in the summer because there's less demand. But I can tell you that I teach in the summer and the classes tend to be smaller and the students tend to be pretty focused. They would have to be, I would think, to take a condensed class of that nature. If you're curious, summer session one, I am teaching a women in literature class. That is English 247. And I'm aware that some of you, depending on your degree program, would need to take a 200 level English class. And 200 level English classes are focused on a particular element of literature, whether it be a time period. So, Women in Literature 1 is about literature written in the 1800s by females, or whether it happened to be about a particular genre, such as Gothic Lit, or whether it happened to be about a particular locale. So, in terms of this particular class, we begin with a short story that might be familiar to you. Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. We actually end with Kate Chopin's novella, The Awakening, which I believe I had mentioned led to the ending of her career. So if you want more information about that class, please let me know. But we are offering a multitude of 200 level English classes. Second summer session, I believe it's a creative writing class. And then we offer about a handful or so of 200 level English classes in the fall, including Gothic literature, which is another class that I teach. And I think I've talked a little bit about the Gothic with you, where we cover classics such as Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as well as some more contemporary works as well, including the text, The Haunting of Hill House, which is a wonderful ghost story, and even The Exorcist, which appeared initially as a best-selling novel. And as you know, I'm very interested in the genre of horror. So even though my name isn't listed on it yet, I am also teaching a class in horror film in the fall semester. It isn't listed under English classes. It doesn't satisfy an English requirement. It satisfies a communication requirement, which is another element of my interests, media and popular culture, and that's a CMN 201 class that talks a little bit about horror film in media and popular culture. So if you're interested in that class, it both actually happen to be online classes, and they're run very similarly to the way this class is, as is my summer Women in Literature class as well. Be happy to tell you some more. And summer session two, if you're curious, I'm offering another online class. This happens to be in public speaking, and we do that through video. So again, if you wanted any information about those classes or any other classes, I know that I, as an advisor, have reached out to my advisees, encouraging them to either register with me or through the Advising Center. The Advising Center can always register you, or to register themselves. I release my pins to my advisees. Not necessarily every advisor does that, but certainly you can reach out to your advisor if you needed your registration pin. And for those of you who might be particularly interested in English classes, if you take 6 of those 200 level or advanced English classes, and again, many students have to already take one for their degree requirements, so that would be 5 additional classes, you could actually graduate with a degree concentration in English. Actually, it's very similar to the liberal arts degree. The distinction is in the electives. Most of the electives are devoted to 200 level English classes. And what's nice about pursuing this degree is that you can change your mind at any point along the way, use the 200 level English classes for electives, and then just transfer your way back into a liberal arts general, which was done deliberately by design. I'm the advisor for that, but if you need any feedback or any kind of information about that program, any English teacher can tell you a little bit more about that. So, where we were was watching A Midsummer Night's Dream. And as you know, A Midsummer Night's Dream has lots of different ways that it can be interpreted. Since this is a literature and film class, I wanted to talk a little bit about how to interpret that play to make it available for contemporary masses, a Hollywood adaptation, which I think you could see they took advantage of by using A-list actors, or at least A-list actors for the time. I can tell you that I watched this particular adaptation initially in the theater, and the theater was full with a wide range of audience members. So it was successful in the box office. So I think they achieved their goals. And of course, adaptations take liberties, and certainly something like a Hollywood adaptation where you can't assume that the audience has read the play ahead of time. It's going to take more adaptation. So we're given that little opening summary that you wouldn't find in the actual play itself. Notice that the play takes place in Athens. Not unusual for Shakespeare to put the locales in his plays in exotic locations. That said, outside of the placement, the play may as well take place in Britain because it seems to be very British in terms of its social norms and societal expectations. And the opening talks a little bit about how the adaptation we saw was going to take place in the Victorian period. Obviously, that is not accurate to Shakespeare's times, which was around the 1500s and the early 1600s. But I think the reason why they made that decision is because usually most audiences have a vague sense of some of the social norms of the Victorian period, certainly in regards to being very conservative sexually. And I think they took advantage of that knowledge to set the play in Victorian times. So, of course, the costumes have been modernized to Victorian times. Necklines are high, as they say at the beginning of the play. And A Midsummer Night's Dream is quite interesting because virginity is such a central concept as it would have been during the time of Shakespeare's English Renaissance. And yet it was also a time of a lot of bawdiness and sexual innuendo. So we've got that contrast there between the two. Some of the decisions that they made seem to me not necessarily to make sense. The idea that they're putting the actors with this quote newfangled contraption, the bicycle, obviously that is not historically accurate. Visually, it's beautiful, so perhaps that's why they decided to have the actors ride bicycles. Certainly, the film production took advantage of the fact that they could go off stage and film outdoor scenes. In fact, they filmed on location in Italy, and it's absolutely majestic. So that's one of the positives of the play. You might have noticed that there was a lot of eating and a lot of celebratory natures, especially at the beginning of the play to set the tone of a Shakespearean comedy, which we know is supposed to be about love and its conflicts, but that ultimately it will resolve in a happy ending, which means no death and either marriage or the promise of marriage. And notice how they took advantage of things like the soundtrack, which is so important in film, and also the time of day. So we move from the daytime to the nighttime. Certainly, A Midsummer Night's Dream is taking advantage of the idea of a lot of mystery associated with nighttime, a lot of eroticism associated with nighttime, and the possibility of the magical world occurring in the nighttime, which is something that we see in the film adaptation as well. When we transition into night, by that point it's thundering and lightning to again illustrate that we're going to get a change in tone, something darker. Things are awry in the fairy world. Fairies aren't necessarily evil the way witches might be seen in, let's say, Macbeth, but they are mysterious and they can be dark, and definitely we get that sense in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And then, of course, by the ending of the play, we're back to daylight and sunlight and celebration and lots of outdoor scenes as well. The production also takes advantage of the fact that you can have special effects, which is something that's much more complicated to do on stage, especially during Shakespearean time. The plot is condensed because if we were going to act out a Shakespearean play in its entirety, it would be much longer than the hour and a half to 2 hours that most audience members expect for a Hollywood film. But even with the story changes and some of the condensing of plot, I think they do a fairly good job of adapting the play so that we get a sense of its spirit. The major issue I have with the play is that they've decided to make one of the characters, Bottom, married in the adaptation we see. He is not married in the actual play itself. I think that's important that he be single, in terms of some of the commentaries about how love makes someone irrational. And that said, I really wish they hadn't have given Bottom a wife, but in this particular version, they do kind of illustrate that he's sort of this henpecked husband. Definitely, he's a laughing stock. Dare I say that Bottom is an ass, and I use that language deliberately because, of course, as the play progresses, we know that Bottom is changed into a literal ass by one of the fairies, Fairy Puck, because Bottom has been acting like an ass. So there's a lot of possibility for humor here. There's a lot of physical humor too in Shakespearean comedies that you don't necessarily get the chance to appreciate if you're just reading the play. So you really need to watch adaptations. That said, watching an adaptation is in no way a substitute for reading the play. It's merely a supplement for reading the play. And I hope at this point you have finished reading the play and you are on to reading our next play, which happens to be A Raisin in the Sun. And of course, we'll watch an adaptation. But that said, these plays are so complex that they deserve to be read just because of all of the nuances in language. And Shakespeare is a master of language as well, writing in both poetry, verse, and also complete sentences, prose. And oftentimes the form of language would indicate something about the rank of the character or the character's changes over the course of the play. So usually verse or poetry would be reserved for the higher orders, those who are more educated, and complete sentences or prose for the lower orders. But expect Shakespeare to mix things up a little bit. Sometimes the lower level characters are speaking in verse or poetry to show that just because one is born into a particular position, that means they can't ascend the chain of being. That chain that was viewed at the time to illustrate hierarchy in society, that all things had a position and God would be at the very top. Even the angels themselves would be ranked based on their power and their ability to reason. And then humanity would be ranked above animal, and certain elements of humanity would be ranked above others. So royalty would be at the top, then nobility, and then finally laborers, men before women, adults before children. You get the idea. The idea is one was born into their rank and they stayed there. But of course, Shakespeare, in many ways, was quite progressive and for his time and would make commentary and question those ideals. He couldn't do it in a very obvious fashion, while it was a very open time in terms of sex and violence, less so in terms of politics. One had to be very careful. That's not to say Shakespeare didn't make political commentary, but he would oftentimes couch it by doing something much more subtle. For instance, showing changes in language between poetry, let's say, and complete sentences to show a character going up or down the chain of being. So quite clever. But as we know, this is not an introduction to Shakespeare class. This is a introduction to literature and film class. So what I wanted to do was to make sure that everybody had a certain level of understanding in terms of plot. And you can see in the notes before I've indicated what was happening in the plot. And we know that a Shakespearean play follows a 5-act structure, and it is something that can be represented in a basically pyramid or a triangle. And that at the lower end on the left-hand side of the beginning of that pyramid or triangle would be Act 1, where we are introduced to characters and expect to see lots of couplings and with characters with very similar names or very similar personalities, so that we are deliberately confused because Shakespeare wanted to emphasize one of those themes, that love is confusing and that one partner is as good as another, that partners can be very easily substituted with one another, even though we maintain that our partner is irreplaceable. That's one of the messages that is embedded within the play. And then if we were to go up that triangle or that pyramid, then we see that Act 2 is where we begin to get the beginning of conflict. And then Act 3, which is the very top of that pyramid or triangle, and then that is the height of conflict. Act 4 is the beginning of resolution as we begin descent on the right-hand side of that pyramid or triangle. And then Act 5 is the very bottom of that pyramid or triangle, and that's on the right-hand side, and that's resolution. A Midsummer Night's Dream is a little bit different because it seems that the play comes to its conclusion after 4 acts and that we don't need Act 5. It almost seems superfluous, but trust me, nothing is superfluous in Shakespeare. There's a good reason for it to be there, or else Shakespeare would not have included it. And what we get in Act 5 is a play within a play. This is very Shakespearean, to basically embed a play within his own play, so that the characters in a Shakespearean play are actually watching a play. This is very meta on Shakespeare's part. And the play that the characters are watching is meant to reflect the topic or theme of the major play itself that Shakespeare was writing. So at any rate, in the first act, where we're introduced to all of these couplings, and notice that all of these couples are involved in love relationships, all of these couples are experiencing conflict in love, and all of these couples represent different stages of relationship and also represent different positions in the social hierarchy. So we're introduced first to Theseus and Hippolyta. They are king and queen of the human world. They are engaged to be married. That's their stage of relationship. And basically their backstory is that Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons, has been conquered by King Theseus in war. This would have been a very kind of typical coupling at the time, that a typical love, a political union, a social union. Obviously, Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons being a very strong female warrior race, is not very happy about being conquered. The idea of power struggles in love is one of the elements in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And we see that by the ending of the play, though, she's not too unhappy. The idea of the Renaissance is that love and affection developed after marriage, not before marriage. And certainly as a comedy, we need to know that we're going to have a happy resolution, or what could at least be viewed as a happy resolution. So then we're introduced to Hermia and Lysander. They're dating as opposed to engaged. They're younger, and they aren't royalty, they're nobles. But they also have conflicts in love. Their conflict is that Hermia's father is defying their union. And at the time, daughter was viewed as a father's property. He could dispose of her as he would property. And then the daughter would be married off, and then her husband could treat her as property. Their love is atypical in the sense that Hermia dares to defy her father, and that would be unusual for the time period. So what we see is a strong female character who actually gets her way by the ending of the play. So again, somewhat subversive for Shakespeare to give us that, but don't expect necessarily every character to experience that. There is a certain level of complexity within Shakespeare, just like there's a certain level of complexity within human relations as well. And basically, her father has denied her this coupling because her father has what he believes is a better suitor. So the better suitor, the father believes, father's name is Aegeus, is Demetrius, and that's who he wants to see his daughter with. The thing is, Lysander and Demetrius are pretty much equal in terms of station, and in personality, they're almost interchangeable. It's a very typical idea of what I call because I said so. If you've ever worked with an authority figure and you've questioned them and their response is because I said so, Aegeus has made a decision. He doesn't have a rationale for it, nor does he need a rationale, and yet his daughter dares to defy him, which would be considered quite outlandish during this particular time period. And in fact, Demetrius, the suitor that Aegeus, Hermia's father, prefers, has a backstory as well. That he was once involved with Helena and had pledged himself to Helena, but he's changed his mind. And now he wants Hermia. And this shows how fickle love can be. And Helena and Hermia have very similar names, not similar personalities the way Lysander and Demetrius do, but similar names so that we can confuse them with one another. Again, because one partner is as good as another. They do have different appearances, though, which becomes important as the play progresses. Hermia is short and is a brunette, which would not be considered to be the ideal of beauty at the time. The ideal of beauty would be Helena's appearance. She's tall and blonde. And yet at the beginning of the play, no one wants Helena. Both Demetrius and Lysander are in love with Hermia, the short brunette. What makes things even more complicated is that Hermia and Helena are best friends, at least at the beginning of the play. By the middle of the play, they become best enemies. Illustrating what love conflict can do is that it can tear apart friendships. So, we know that Demetrius at this point has fallen out of love with Helena and he wants Hermia. Hermia wants nothing to do with him. This shows another element of love, unrequited love, where one partner is in love and the other isn't. This is also seen with Helena, who loves Demetrius, and while he used to love her, he no longer does. So again, Helena is chasing after Demetrius and unrequited love. So as we're introduced to all of these conflicts with humans, we're also introduced to a fairy world because there's a fantasy world here. Fairy Oberon and Fairy Titania. They're the king and queen, so they would be considered at the top of the chain of being, in effect. Even more so than Theseus and Hippolyta, because fairies are superior to humans, or at least they should be. But Fairy Oberon and Titania, they're an older couple, and they are married. So they're not dating, nor are they engaged. But they, too, are having difficulties in love. They are having an argument over power struggles. With a changeling child, basically a changeling, if you know fairy folklore, is a child that has been substituted by the fairies for a human child, that the fairies come in the middle of the night and steal a human baby and leave a changeling, a fairy child, in its place. And Shakespeare took that idea, but he took liberties with it for artistic purposes. The backstory we're given with this changeling is that Titania, the queen of the fairies, had a human serving woman who died in childbirth, and basically Titania feels this sense of obligation of raising this boy, and her husband Oberon demands that Titania hand over the boy, and she refuses. In fact, she forswears their marriage bed, which means she's denying him sexual relations through their power struggle. So Oberon is quite upset over this, that his wife would dare to defy him. By the ending of the play, she does not get her way. So again, things are complicated with Shakespeare. But Fairy Oberon decides that he wants revenge. So while we have all of these plots going on, we're also introduced to Bottom and his cohorts. Bottom is a laborer. He's at the bottom of the chain of being. And in the play itself, he's not involved in a love relationship initially. They are rehearsing a play about love. And the play happens to be called Pyramus and Thisbe. It's about how love can go so badly that it can result in death. In fact, the plot very much mimics, in some respects, Romeo and Juliet, a very famous Shakespearean play that's thought to have been written around the same time as A Midsummer Night's Dream. So the way that all of this unfolds is that Aegeus, Hermia's father, who is so frustrated, goes to the law of the lands, King Theseus, asking King Theseus to please make his daughter obey. King Theseus tells Hermia, obey your father. But he does give Hermia time to think about her options. And the result, if she doesn't obey her father, is that she will either be put in a nunnery or she will be killed. She will face death. Both would be considered equally horrible. But he gives her time to think about it. Certainly this is necessary as a plot device so that she can do what many young people do when they're denied love. They can run away together. But that's what will happen in A Midsummer Night's Dream. One might also say that Theseus is a clever politician, that he realizes that making a decision is going to anger somebody. So best to perhaps postpone that decision and hope that perhaps things resolve on their own, which is pretty much what happens. Or you can say that also what we've got is a Theseus who feels a little bit of empathy because he's having his own love relationship problem. So therefore, he allows Hermia some time to think about things. But what Hermia and Lysander decide to do is to run away in the woods. And notice how the play begins in Athens, which represents civilization and order, the law of man, where we go to the woods. And we saw this with young Goodman Brown as well. There's something that's untamed, something that's natural, that defies the law of man, the wilderness, something that is wild. Before they run away, it turns out that Hermia tells her best friend Helena the plan. And then Helena, in this convoluted logic, decides to tell Demetrius that Hermia and Lysander are going to run away. And Helena rationalizes this by saying, perhaps Demetrius will be so grateful to me, he'll love me again, or realize that he has no chance with Hermia. Of course, that's not what he does. He runs after Hermia in the forest, and that means Helena has to run after him. So not only does this show what happens when we're in love, we're not able to think clearly, but it also shows that Shakespeare was very deliberate about getting all of these characters into the woods. So in some ways, this could be a plot device as well. So Hermia and or Helena and Demetrius flee into the woods, and then Bottom and his cohorts decide they should rehearse in the woods because they're less likely to be interrupted than they would be in the city. Again, this gets all of the major characters into the woods. And we know that Fairy Oberon is quite upset with his wife, who won't give him the changeling. And he never says why he wants the changeling. It's very similar to Aegeus and the parallel I made with him, Because I Said So. Oberon doesn't need to have a reason, Fairy Oberon. He demands something of his wife. She dares to defy him. So he, in anger, goes to Puck, which is his fairy servant. Notice Puck is not involved in a love relationship. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why Puck is able to think clearly in a way the other characters can't. And Oberon tells Puck to basically fetch some love juice. And the idea behind the love juice is that if it's placed in the eyes of someone who is sleeping, when they awake, they fall in love with the first thing that they see. In other words, that love can be manipulated very easily through appearance, which is another element that is associated with the Midsummer Night's Dream, as well as that love is like a magic spell, that when we are in love, we are no longer in control, no longer reasonable, no longer rational. And Puck is given orders to put the love juice on the man wearing the Athenian garb, which is brilliant because this gives the actor playing Puck an opportunity to interpret it one of two ways. Either Puck makes an innocent mistake and he puts it on the wrong man's eyes, or Puck knows darn well whose eyes he's supposed to put the love juice on, and he decides not to do that to create a little bit of chaos and be a bit mischievous, because Puck, also known as Robin Goodfellow, also is part of fairy folklore and is known as a mischievous spirit. So again, the actor can have a lot of fun with this, but nevertheless, Puck ends up putting the love juice on the wrong man's eyes. And also, Puck decides on his own, because he's mischievous, to turn Bottom, who acts like an ass, into an ass, a donkey. And of course, after the fairy Titania wakes up with the love juice in her eyes, the first thing she sees is Bottom, who is now both a figurative and literal ass. To illustrate that love is blind. In fact, we can even fall in love with an ass and not even realize it. How's that for timeless and universal themes? And of course, Puck, and notice I put this in quotation marks, mistakenly, unquote, puts the love juice on Lysander. So now Lysander loves Helena. And then Puck, to rectify things, has the love juice placed on Demetrius's eyes. So Demetrius loves Helena. But now we're in Act 3 of the play, and we've got both men loving Helena, the tall blonde, rather than Hermia, the short brunette. The exact opposite of how the play began. And this leads to lots of possibilities for conflict And in fact, we see these former best friends turn into terrible enemies where they're hurling insults at one another. If this were a tragedy, they'd come to blows and actually kill one another. But we know it's not a tragedy, so we have to have a happy resolution. And that means there has to be some intervention, which means that the love juice is removed from Lysandra's eyes so that he goes back to loving Hermia. The love juice remains on Demetrius's eyes so that he remains loving Helena. And I know that this, quote, happy ending, unquote, might seem uncomfortable for contemporary audiences because the idea is that there is still some manipulation involved. Yes, the love juice is removed from Titania so that she realizes that she was in love with an ass, but she's lost the changeling. So we can't necessarily say that the play is all about the importance of female power because that's basically undercut with what we get with Titania. The donkey spell is removed from Bottom because, well, for a happy ending, we can't leave a human being as an ass. But he still acts like an ass. There's lots of opportunities for humor here. King Theseus, who had to make a decision, decides that this is the best of all possible worlds because the four lovers are happy with one another. Therefore, the only one he has to overrule is Hermia's father's Aegeus. So that's the best of all possible outcomes. So that's what he does. And of course, the idea that Hermia is so willing to take back Lysander after he's insulted her is problematic from a modern day perspective, just as it's problematic that Helena is willing to chase after Demetrius and says, treat me like your dog. That's called stalking, and it also shows a great level of passivity. But think about the time period and also the idea, some of what Helena talks about, that women were not made to woo. They should be wooed instead. And Helena could be seen as strong on some levels because she acts as pursuer and gets her way. Even though, again, the coupling, we have to wonder how happy is that ending because Helena is with Demetrius, not because Demetrius wants to be, but because Demetrius has been manipulated by love juice. But then again, we could go back and say that prior to the play, Demetrius loved Helena, so therefore this is a restoration of order. And then it seems like the play is over, but it's not because we have an Act 5. And this is where we get that ridiculous play, Pyramus and Thisbe. And so many things happen at this level. We see poor writing and poor acting in Pyramus and Thisbe. This is Shakespeare's commentary on his competition, that in contrast to the first 4 acts of what we saw written by Shakespeare, we could spend our time and money watching a play by lesser playwrights with lesser actors, and we would get something like Pyramus and Thisbe, which is very much like, I liken it to an elementary school production where everything is literal. Somebody has to play Wall, for instance. There have to be all kinds of disclaimers. The actors mangle language. We see how pompous Bottom is. And there's a great opportunity for some physical humor here in the acting out of Pyramus and Thisbe. There's humor. There's also some bawdiness. There's some sex jokes in there that we'll talk about later. And we also get commentary in the fact that the major characters of the play are watching this performance of Pyramus and Thisbe, laughing at it, mocking it, but never once realizing that they themselves were equally absurd when it came to love previously. In other words, they still have a lack of insight about love. And if we take this a step further, it's for us as audience watching A Midsummer Night's Dream and watching a Pyramus and Thisbe within A Midsummer Night's Dream. That if we're laughing and we're mocking and we never once stop to think about how absurd we are when it comes to our own love relationships, we too have a lack of insight. There's a lot that individuals could be offended about in this play, so it makes sense that we've got a final speech by Puck sort of apologizing. It's one of Shakespeare's perhaps best known speeches. If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended, that you have slumbered here. Notice how important dreams are and sleep is in this play. Think about the title, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and think about the parallels between being asleep or dreaming to being in love. That you're not awake, you're not seeing things. When you're dreaming, it's not real. It's something that is temporary. It's something that can be quite negative. It could be a nightmare. Um, and also, think about the language we use. We fall in love or we fall asleep. And there are lots of negative associations with falling. Things that are out of our control, things that can hurt, things that can even kill. And in addition to love being like dreams or love being like being asleep, and which Puck is talking about in his final speech. A midsummer. Midsummer is actually a pagan holiday. There's a lot of pagan references in this play, including the fairy world. And midsummer is the longest day of the year, the equinox. And that said, from a pagan perspective, it was a day associated with fertility. It was one of the most sexually charged days of the year that was celebrated through sexual union. So talk about a play where it's so important that a woman be a virgin. If she wasn't a virgin prior to marriage, she was considered to be damaged goods. And yet it's occurring in one of the most sexually charged days of the year. Another pagan day is referenced in the play May Day. And May Day, the 1st of May, was also a pagan holiday that was very sexually charged, that was associated with fertility. And the way that it was celebrated was through sexual union, as was Midsummer. You might have heard of the maypole in terms of May Day. And I don't know if elementary school children still celebrate May Day, where they dance around a maypole. But I can tell you that from the pagan perspective, the maypole was a phallic symbol. It was supposed to represent the penis, which gives a whole different level of understanding of the maypole as children are dancing around it, not even understanding what they're doing. And it explains some of the insults, and they are insults in Act 3, which we'll talk about next class, where at one point, Hermia, the short brunette, calls her former best friend, "You painted maypole." So she's calling Helena, who's tall and thin, a maypole, not only because she resembles a maypole, which is tall and thin, but she's also calling her a penis or a phallus. Worse, she's calling her friend painted, which means cosmetics. The idea that this is a false beauty and it's a manipulative beauty, that cosmetics would be associated with strumpets or whores. So all of that is embedded within the play Midsummer Night's Dream as we start talking about some of the language. And talking about language in Puck's final speech where he supposedly apologizes. That said, Puck says if he is an honest Puck. The thing is, Puck is not honest. And or else the Puck a liar call, he says. But Puck is a liar, so you have to wonder, can we even believe this apology? Which is very Puck-like and also very clever of Shakespeare, because basically Puck is a kind of stand-in for Shakespeare, controlling and manipulating the action. So this is the character Puck apologizing, but not really. This is the actor playing Puck apologizing, but not really. And this is Shakespeare through the actor, through the character, apologizing, but not really. So Shakespeare gets the last laugh, even asking for applause. Give me your hands if we be friends. And he says to escape the serpent's tongue, that he doesn't want any booing or hissing. Lots of themes in this play, that love makes everybody, regardless of age or status, an idiot. But at least Shakespeare's equal opportunity with that. Love can destroy friendships. Which we see with Helena and Hermia. Love is like a spell, that once we're under its control, we can no longer be responsible for our own actions, which we see with the characters in the Love Juice. Love is like a dream. Again, something that's unreal, something that cannot be controlled. That beauty necessarily need not be tall and blonde, because it's Hermia, the short brunette, who has all of the attention at the beginning of the play. That females can defy powerful male figures, and sometimes they can do so successfully and sometimes not. Hermia does so successfully. She defies her father Aegeus, and she gets her way at the ending of the play. Titania, however, defies her male authority figure. her husband, Oberon, and Titania is humiliated, made to fall in love with an ass, and loses, basically, the changeling boy. And in some ways, it was a stroke of brilliance because Oberon realized that if Titania was in love, she would no longer be interested in this changeling. Another commentary about love, that when we're in love, the things that used to matter to us, like our responsibilities or our obligations, no longer do. And I guess you can see Theseus and Hippolyta as sort of in the mid-range, where Hippolyta wasn't happy as the queen of the Amazons to be conquered, but by the ending of the play, it seems that she and Theseus have reached a certain understanding and affection for one another. And then, of course, we've got the complications of Helena, who's a very weak character, who basically has no self-esteem and throws herself at the feet of a man. And yet also she's brave enough to take on the role of pursuer and gets her way at the ending of the play. Virginity is so important in this play. There are many references to the idea of virginity. At the very beginning of the play, there's even an accusation that there's been some wooing going on that might have resulted in the taking of virginity. Made love to. Made love to means to woo. It doesn't necessarily mean a direct sexual union. Notice that when Helena pursues Demetrius in the woods, and where he says that he's not interested in her, and if she continues to pursue him, he will do her mischief in the woods and take advantage of the opportunity. In other words, take her virginity. We know that Hermia and Lysander, when they've run away into the woods, Lysander tries to snuggle with Hermia and lie next to her, and she says, "No, thou runnest prettily, lie further off." Basically, she's saying is that we might be tempted to engage in sexual union prior to marriage, and we can't do that, or else I lose my worth, or at least that's how society would view it. So virginity is important, and yet we've got this play that's set in midsummer, May Day and the summer solstice, both pagan holidays that are known for sexuality, and we get a lot of sexual innuendo and a lot of bawdiness here that I'll talk about, including that the donkey or the ass during Shakespearean times would be viewed as the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom. So there's some sexual humor here going on as well with Bottom. And the assumption is that Bottom and Titania consummate their relationship. And that too is somewhat problematic because I guess you could say Titania is a human, though she acts like a human, but certainly Bottom is not human. He's an animal. So all of those sexual questions are embedded within the text. For the writing, assume that you're going to have a good amount of poetry. I hope you were able to notice in the adaptation we saw how often the lines rhymed with one another. And Shakespeare will give us example of good rhyme, natural rhyme that forwards plot with our major characters. He'll also give us example of bad rhyme. For instance, Bottom when he's rehearsing his play, when he says, "The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far." And while it rhymes, it's nonsensical, and it definitely isn't good, again, to kind of illustrate the kind of rhyme we might experience with Shakespeare's competition, as opposed to Shakespeare's own rhyme. Not only will we see rhyme, but we will see something called iambic pentameter, a 10-syllable line, which we will discuss again when we talk about Shakespearean sonnets, which are Shakespearean poems. And that means that you can expect to have some sort of rhythm or beats. And this is a 10-syllable line. Take perhaps Shakespeare's most famous sonnet, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" If you were to go through it with its consonants, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" That's by no coincidence 10 syllables of stressed and unstressed, which sounds ba-bum, 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 like a heartbeat, which many have argued is the first sound we all hear in our mother's womb, which is why Shakespeare's language can be so attractive to the ear. Expect lots of symbolism in Shakespeare, which we will be talking about, the maypole being just one of many, and also that mix of verse and prose. And you can see that what I've included is I've included some rhymes and some quotes that I'm going to be talking about next class. I'm well aware of the time here. I took some time to talk about registration, but I thought that was important. And In terms of our attendance question, I wanted to ask you to respond by Wednesday the 3rd. Certainly, if you need more time, feel free to ask me for an extension. I'm still a bit behind with responding to attendance form responses, but I'm getting there, just like I'm getting to finishing up the paper number 1 that you distributed. So that I can return that to you, or that you submitted, I should say, so that I can return that to you. So, the attendance question is, what did you find thus far to be the most surprising or interesting thing about the play, and why? Now that I hope you've read A Midsummer Night's Dream in its entirety, and I've talked a little bit about some of the elements in A Midsummer Night's Dream, what did you find to be surprising or interesting? It could be either about the text or the film, or a combination of the two. Notice I've included the text for Raisin in the Sun, which you should be reading now at this point, though we will also be seeing a production. Keep in mind that A Raisin in the Sun is not included in your textbook, so this is an additional text that I had ordered for us in class, but I was able to also find a free link for it online that you could access. So what we're going to do next class is talk a little bit about Shakespearean quotes, and then prepare for Raisin in the Sun. And also talk a little bit about our next paper. And the next paper is very similar to what you did with paper number 1, except you would be writing about either Oedipus the King, our first play, or you would be writing about A Midsummer Night's Dream, our second play, or ultimately you would be writing about A Raisin in the Sun, our third and final play, to either identify a play through text or performance that you think should be in the literary canon and why, or should not be in the literary canon and why, or to identify a text or performance that you think has contemporary relevance and why, or does not have contemporary relevance and why, or create your own essay topic, just as long as you get the topic approved by me. So I'll have a handout for you next class that I'll be talking briefly about. But basically, you're duplicating what you did with the first paper in terms of length, 4 to 5 pages, in terms of you writing a critical paper, not using outside resources. And that would be due by the ending of the semester, so we still have a good amount of time to talk about the plays, as well as submit in paper number 1 and get that back. And you all have the option of rewriting paper number 1. I just ask that you submit in that revision by the last day of class, or earlier. Earlier is always nice. That you hand in the original with my commentary along with your revision, and you get the higher of the 2 grades. And I see the first paper as a kind of learning exercise, and certainly reach out to me if you need further direction. The second paper would be due at the ending of the semester, and you wouldn't have time to rewrite it, the idea being that you wouldn't need to, because you've already learned how to write a paper with the first paper. So that's where we are right now. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and next class we will talk about quotation in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and also start talking about A Raisin in the Sun. Take care. Bye-bye.